once again about our Friends Day on September the 15th, as well as it's also called National Back to Church Sunday that we are using in conjunction with our Friends Day. Let me also remind you that out in the foyer you can find some of these little cards out there on one of the tables out there, and you might take one of these and just share it with a friend and invite them to come to church with you on that particular Sunday. Also, I'd encourage you to make an extra effort on your part to try to be here on that day. Also, that Sunday evening, we're going to have our annual outside devotional where we have a small fire that's out there. You're all encouraged to bring your camp chairs or your patio chairs or whatever, and we'll just kind of gather around out there, and I'll have a short devotional thought, and maybe we'll cook some s'mores and things of that nature. And so it's always a good time to get together for that kind of fellowship. And so remember, September the 15th is our Friends Day, and then that evening is our outside devotional together with one another. As you recall, I spent some time over in Israel here back in May. And one of the things that I saw there was the culture wars that were going on in Israel. And culture wars is not really different when it comes down to us. Today, we find ourselves in the midst of a culture war. We find those who are immoral fighting against that which is moral. You have evil called good and good called evil and things of that nature. And so we find ourselves in the midst of a culture war on any number of levels. That shouldn't surprise us. Culture wars really have been going on probably since almost the beginning of time. If you go over to Genesis, the 6th chapter, and verse 5, there it says that, when it came down to man, that their minds were on evil continually. That they came up with things, and it was such a terrible situation that the result of that was that God destroyed the world by water, saving only 8 people who entered into the ark. Some of you may not know this, but last week, I guess it was last week, kind of the week before that, Lori and I spent some time back in Kentucky, and we went up to the northern part of Kentucky, and up there is a thing called Ark Encounter. It's where they've built a replica of the ark itself with its dimensions. The thing is absolutely huge. And one of the things that really struck me, I had a number of aha moments when we were touring around through the ark and so forth, but one was a video, and during the video, they decided that they're going to have kind of almost like we would a TV crew or a news crew that would go and interview Noah. And so they were interviewing Noah, and so they had the interviewee, a woman it was, and then they had a stenographer that was writing everything down that he was saying, and some other guy doing something. And while she was interviewing him, she asked him, and so why is it that God is destroying the world? And Noah said, he goes, because of sin in the world, that man's mind is on evil continuously. Look around you, can't you see it? So you're saying that the world is going to be destroyed because of sin. And Noah said, exactly because of sin. And the stenographer, he gets up and he's angry, and he stands up and he says, you know what? He goes, listen. He goes, that which you call sin is my freedom. You're a bigot. And I thought to myself, man, that guy could have been living right now, because that's really true when you talk about sin in our world. So there was a culture war even all the way back in the days of Noah. And as you move forward into history, you get into the period of Judges. At almost the end of every section of the Judges, it will say, in those days there was no king, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. They went far beyond the boundaries of the moral code that God would have them live according to. And as you read through the history of Israel, you'll see moments or periods in which Israel seemed to be godly, but then you'll see a lot of periods of Israel's history where they were very ungodly and sin ran rampant among them. Well, you can move into Jesus' day, and you'll see the exact same thing taking place. When you move over to Romans, the 1st chapter, Paul, he outlines a series of sins that were present in his day. There he says in verse 28 of chapter 1, and just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness and wickedness and greed and evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. And although they know the ordinances of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but are also in hearty approval of those who practice them. he lays out 23 sins. And most of those sins probably would say, well, you know, that which you call sin is my freedom. And what is really scary here is he talks about those who may not be practicing those sins, but those who give hearty approval to those sins. Talking about a culture war that is going on. Over in 1 Timothy, the 4th chapter, and verse 1, in that section of Scripture, Paul is talking about latter times, which I believe he's talking about today. But he says, but the Spirit explicitly says, excuse me, that in later times, some will fall away from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and to doctrines of demons, by means of the hypocrisy of liars seared in their own conscience as with a branding iron. Men who forbid marriage, advocate abstaining from foods which God created to be gratefully shared in by those who believe and know the truth. For everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with gratitude. He's talking about a culture war. And so we have culture wars not only throughout history, but we find them even today. So when you talk about culture wars, you're talking about a living God, following the living God, or following the devices of men. Now, what you're probably thinking at this point is, what does that have to do with a report on Israel or another section of Israel? Well, let me just kind of take you back and review very quick with you, and then I'll make the application. You'll see what I'm talking about. When you talk about Israel, Israel has a number of names. It was called Canaan. It's called the land of Israel. The promised land. It was called Palestine, and of course called the Holy Lands. Israel is an incredible country when you think of it only being about 80 miles long and 30 miles wide. How strategically great God has placed it is like a land bridge between civilizations that sits perfectly in the world to accomplish the scheme of redemption. In other words, it's right between Africa that goes to the south, and then of course to the north to Asia Minor, and so forth, over to Europe as you go west. As you remember, we talked about Caesarea Maritima, where the Romans came and landed their ships. Herod the Great made a great city there that he called Caesarea, and there I think it was like 120 warships could park in that, or could come up and dock in that place alone. And so there was a thoroughfare of Europeans coming in through into Palestine, into Israel, and being influenced by God. It was a great land bridge, and a lot of incredible things happened there. This evening, what I want to do is I want to take you back to Galilee. Remember, we began by talking about Beersheba, and we talked about going from Beersheba to Dan, and we started off in Beersheba where Abraham was, and then we went from there up to the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea up to Masada. We talked about Qumran and then Jericho. Well, finally we arrive in Galilee. Galilee really is where the ministry of Jesus began. I know he first spoke in Nazareth and so forth. He comes from Nazareth, but he is rejected by them, and he will spend a good portion of his ministry the first year or two in the Galilean area. If you open your Bible to Luke chapter 4, notice what is said here in this section of Scripture. Luke chapter 4, beginning in verses 14 and 16, and then down to 31. And Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through all the surrounding district. And he began teaching in their synagogues and was praised by all. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he entered into the synagogue on the Sabbath, and he stood up and he read, and he wrote from the book of Isaiah. They reject him because he says, what I've just read, that it's me. And he sits down, and they decide they want to kill him because of it. Look at verse 31. He came down to Capernaum, a city of Galilee, and he was teaching them on the Sabbath, and they were amazed at his teaching, for his message was with authority. So Jesus leaves Nazareth after the rejection. He goes down to Galilee, in particular Capernaum, but he doesn't just go to Capernaum. If you look at the map there, you'll see that he'll go to Capernaum, he'll go to Chorazin, he'll go to Magdala, he will go to Caesarea Philippi, he'll go to Bethsaida. He goes to a lot of different areas around the Galilean area, certainly around the Sea of Galilee, it says, and that's where he's going to begin his ministry. But as he begins his ministry, he will find himself in the midst of a culture war. something that was real in his time. Now, this place here is where I stayed, or the group that I went with. We stayed here at the kibbutz Genosar, and it was on the Sea of Galilee and so forth. And so that was kind of our staging area, and then we began to go out. And so we went to Tel Dan, we went to Caesarea Philippi, we went to Chorazin, we went to Bethsaida. But what I want to do is I want us to focus in on these first three places. I want us to consider Chorazin. I want us to look at Tel Dan, and then finally Caesarea Philippi. And in each of those, you'll see a striking culture war that is going on there. As we traveled out from the place, we crossed the Jordan River, and so we stopped and took pictures of the Jordan River. I have to tell you, I was somewhat disappointed. I thought the Jordan River was going to be like super wide, and so I did some studying about, well, why is this thing not seem all that big of a deal? And of course, Josephus and other historians said that there were a number of great earthquakes that happened up in that region that changed a lot of the water system, and that the Jordan is not quite as big as it once was. At one time, it was a very large, wide river, but today is not so much that way. And so that's kind of the picture of the Jordan River, which is not a whole lot bigger than the Middle Fork of the Salmon River, except that it's probably quite a bit deeper and so forth. And so we crossed the Jordan River, and I thought that you'd want to see at least what the Jordan River was. And then we came to the first city, and that was Chorazin. Chorazin is an interesting place. The thing about Chorazin is that you'll find that there were several cities that Jesus said, that he condemned because of their rejecting of his message and the miracles that he had performed there. Chorazin is around about 3 miles, 2.8 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. It was established in first century BC or first century AD, and it's known best probably for growing wheat. In fact, they say about Chorazin that it grows the best wheat in the nation. In fact, it's the wheat that they use for all their huge holidays. And so most Jewish holidays, if you look at them, centered around the agriculture of the day and so forth. And so in Chorazin, as you begin to go through this city and so forth, you'll see that it was a city that was made of basalt, which is a kind of a black rock. And so all the rock around is hewed from the rock itself. They grew an incredible kind of wheat that was there as a nation. The picture that you see behind me is a synagogue off to the left, and then to the right, you will see a ritual bath. Remember, I've talked to you about the mikvahs and so forth, ritual cleansing bath and so forth. This was a really fairly large ritual bath that was set up not too far from the synagogue in order for those who were going to go worship would probably go through the mikvah, through a ritual cleansing and so forth, and then on over to the synagogue itself. This synagogue that you see behind me probably is not the original synagogue in the first century when Jesus would have been here. This probably is more of a second or third century synagogue. But it tells you something about the evolution of the Jews of that day, from Jesus probably going through Chorazin all the way up into the 3rd and 4th century there. For instance, you notice that there is the seat of Moses that is in the synagogue itself. Now, you can't read this, okay, so I have to read it for you, but it says, one of the important finds in the Chorazin synagogue is a decorated basalt chair with an Aramaic inscription which mentioned Udan, the son of Ishmael, who donated of his wealth to the building of the synagogue. The seat was probably intended for dignitaries. And so you would expect me to take a picture on that seat, right? Well, I didn't. I didn't take a picture. A number of our party, they took pictures on the seat, but I just was not into feeling very dignitary-like on that day, and so I didn't take a seat on the seat of Moses. But if you look at Matthew, the 23rd chapter, verses 2 and 3, you'll see where in synagogues there were the seats of Moses, seats of authority, seats for dignitaries and so forth. And in this particular synagogue, you'll find a seat of Moses, a place of authority, a place of significant power when it came down to maybe the officials who came into that place. And so when Jesus talks about those who wanted to have seats or special seats and so forth in Matthew, the 23rd chapter, that's probably what he's talking about. those who want the best seats in the house, who felt that they deserved it because of whatever they may have accomplished or achieved as faithful Jews and so forth. Here's one that surprised me that was in some of the foundation, and that was the head of Medusa. It's part of the decoration of one of the rock foundations of the synagogue. Now, if this is a 2nd or 3rd century synagogue, the foundation of it, don't you think that seems just a little bit strange? I mean, we're talking about a culture war. We're talking about how far they are moving away from God to the point that they have in their, as a part of the foundation heads, you have a rendition of Medusa. So who was Medusa? Any of you can remember the Medusa of Greek mythology and so forth? Well, again, you can't see this, so I have to read it to you. In Greek mythology, Medusa was one of the 3 Gorgons. Whoever dared to look at her in the face was instantly turned what? Turned into stone, okay? But Perseus, he averts his eyes, succeeded in killing her, and the winged horse Pegasus was born from her flowing blood. So if you ever wonder where did Pegasus came from, it came from Medusa's blood. So how did that become a part of the foundation stone of a synagogue who is dedicated monotheistically to one God and one God alone? In fact, part of the 10 Commandments says, you shall have no other gods before me. And yet here you have that as a part of their foundation. I'm talking about a culture war that they found themselves going through. Remember I said to you that Jesus had some hard words to say to them because, listen, of all the miracles that Jesus said, Jesus performed a lot of miracles in Capernaum. This morning, I think I just mentioned to you like 5 of them, but there are many more that he performed that, that are not recorded there. But here's what he said. Woe to you, Chorazin. This is Jesus speaking. Woe to you, Chorazin. Woe to you, Bethsaida. For if the miracles had occurred in Tyre and Sidon, which occurred in you, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. Nevertheless, I say to you, it shall be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon in the day of judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum, will not be exalted to heaven, will you? You shall descend to Hades, for if the miracles had occurred in Sodom, which occurred in you, it would have remained to this day. So Jesus is going to these places. And when he's going to these places, he's running into some hard ground to cover. In fact, he performed signs and miracles and wonders in all these places, but they reject him. And as a result, he says, woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida, woe to you, Capernaum, because you rejected the Son of God. It's going to be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon and Sodom than it is for you. Culture wars that are there. That was Chorazin. Jesus performed a lot of miracles in Chorazin, and yet they rejected him. We then move from Chorazin to Tel Dan. Dan is ancient Laish. It's an enormous ancient city at the furthermost northern tip of Israel, dating back to at least 2000 BC. So we're talking about 4,000 years. Originally, the city was a Canaanite city. It was a large city. It covered 50 acres of ground. Most of you know about farming in our area since we're in an agricultural area. And so if you've ever looked at a 100-acre field, you're talking about significant amount of ground. If you're talking about a 50-acre field, you're talking about still a significant amount of ground. And so this here is a fortress city, was Laish or Dan. So how did it become Dan? Can y'all kind of remember a little bit how Laish became Dan? Remember after Moses after the children of Israel had went into the promised land and the land was divided up for them to have as inheritance and so forth, Dan was given a southern part of the country and was told to overcome it and to take it. But they found it extremely hard going. And because it was hard going, the Philistines overcame them. And so the Danites, they decided to find better ground. And so they went to the tippy-top part of Israel, almost as far as you can go up to Dan. Dan is about 30 miles north, 28 miles north of Galilee, or the Sea of Galilee. So it's fairly well up there. Dan is a lush part of the country. It's not far from Hermon, and so it's some really nice land that is there. And so the children of Israel, the tribe of Dan, they went to the north and they overcome the Canaanites at Laish, and they take the city from them. They burn it almost to the ground and then rebuild it once again. So now they inhabit Dan. Well, that's not the only thing we know about Dan. You know, you probably can recall that's a place that Abraham went up to when Sodom, or when Lot was taken by the Southern Confederacy, and they took him captive, and Abraham got his men together, and they went up there, and they pursued them all the way to Dan, and they got Lot back. Okay, so part of Tel Dan is this gate that's called Dan's Gate, or Abraham's Gate. It's called Abraham's Gate because of him going up to Dan and getting his nephew back from the Southern Confederacy and so forth. The picture that you see on your right is an archaeological dig where they have unearthed the gate itself. The picture to your left is a rendition of what that gate probably looked like in reality before the thousands of years have beat it down and so forth. So you can see that it was a significantly fortified city, and that the gate was a big city, and it was the main entrance into the city itself. But there's also another entrance into the city, and that's the one that you see that is behind me. When you walk into the city, you'll see these walls that are built up on rocks and stones that have been carved and so forth, and they are built up, and they're fairly large, and they're fairly small compared to what they were in its heyday and so forth. This place here to your right is also a place for dignitaries. You've heard about elders who have went to the gates of the city, and there they would make decisions and things of that nature. That's what this is here. So this is a place where rulings took place, where people brought different kinds of conflicts that they had with one another, and they'd bring them to the elders who sit in a seat of authority, and they would make judgment, or a judgment seat itself. Again, people went up there and squatted down like they were sitting on a stone, but I'm too cool for that, so I just kind of leaned up against it and said, take my picture here and so forth. So anyway, it's a place of authority there. Dan is where Jeroboam led Israel into idolatry. That is when the northern and southern kingdom, when it divided, from Rehoboam and Jeroboam took, a good portion of the northern kingdom with him. He took them into idolatry, or into false worship of gods, and there he erected high places, and he erected a huge altar. The altar that you see that is behind me, let's see if I can get to it. It's a still rendition of what that altar looked like. They have the real thing in the museum in Jerusalem and so forth. But you see, this altar here is huge. We're not talking about a small altar. We're talking about a huge altar, and this altar was offered to other gods, and not the God of Israel, but was offered to animals or to calves and so forth. That's what's going on here in this section. So you see here where they're offering up animals to God. There it says, and Jeroboam ordained a feast, and he delivered upon the altar sacrificing to calves. That's what he did. He said they don't have to go all the way to the south to Jerusalem to worship God on the Passover. You can do it right up here. We can have gods right here, and I'll establish my own priest, and we'll establish our own laws, and we'll do things our way. It was a culture war that's going on at the place of Dan. In fact, every time you talk about Jeroboam, false worship that was instituted by Jeroboam became the standard by which all the following kings of the northern tribes would be measured. And no less than 20 times in the Word of God, he condemns the sins of Jeroboam and how he led Israel to sin. Pretty scary stuff when you think about that. So from Beer to Dan, from Beersheba to Dan, all of Israel, from the southernmost tip to the northernmost tip and so forth. You have all Israel there, and here you have a good portion of Israel, the northern kingdom, worshiping false gods and worshiping calves and worshiping and Ashtoreths and trees and things of that nature. One of the things that they found in Tel Dan that I thought was really interesting was a thing called Tel Dan Steva. It was a stone slab that was discovered in 1994 from a stone wall that verifies or validates the legitimacy of David being the king. Some of you may know this, and maybe you don't know this, but not everyone believes that there was a king by the name of David. They challenged that for a lot of years. In 1994, it put an end to that thing when they found this stone slab that was where it talked about the house of David. I was trying to find my notes here really quickly. Let me just see if I can find it because I want to say it accurately. I think his name was Herkin, but it might be something different than that. A king had conquered the city, and he put up a slab there and said that he had conquered the house of David, which says, in terms of antiquity, in terms of history, there was a king by the name of David, and there it was for them to see in history itself. Dan is interesting that there are 3 tributaries that feed the Jordan River. The water around Dan is absolutely beautiful. It's gorgeous. You can see some of it behind me there. There is the River Seir Dan, which is a river. It provides 50% of all the water that goes into the Jordan. It's the headwaters of Jordan, if you will, as well as the Hermon Springs up in Caesarea Philippi that we'll talk about here in a moment. Most of the water that Israel uses for drinking water and things of that nature comes out of the Sea of Galilee. So every day, almost by the hour, they have men who are up there at the headwaters and then moving down towards the Sea of Galilee who are constantly testing the water for any kinds of poisons or contamination or anything like that, whether it's from Seir or whether it's from the Dan River or the Hermon Springs. They're checking it to make sure that the water is pure because it's going to fill up Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, and then it's going to go north along the Jordan towards the Dead Sea and so forth. Israel absolutely depends on that water, and so it's got enemies. It's got enemies to the north in terms of Syria and Hezbollah and so forth and things of that nature, and so they're constantly testing that water to make sure the water is a pure water. So the headwaters for the Jordan River begins up at Dan and up at Caesarea Philippi, and then of course in the Seir River. So that was Dan. You can see the culture war that was going on in that area of the world that goes back into antiquity. Then we went from Tel Dan to Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi is an interesting place. It's a beautiful place when you think about it. It's named after Herod the Great's son, Philip, the tetrarch of Trachonitis. Herod the Great was an incredible king in his day. They said of Herod that no one did as much for Israel in terms of technology, in terms of development, as King Herod did. And when you see some of the things later in probably reports down the line, you'll see what some incredible things he did. Well, Philip tried to do some incredible things as well, and one of the things he did is he built a city at Caesarea Philippi, and he named it after himself. But he's smart enough to know where his power was, which is with Caesar himself, and so he names it, gives it both. Caesarea Philippi, not Philippi, Caesarea. Smart guy when you think about it. So it's 30 miles north of the Sea of Galilee on a terrace at the foot of Mount Hermon, about 4 miles from Dan. Very lush setting. It's full of all kinds of life. It anciently was called Penius or Penium because of its cavern, or the temple of Pan and so forth. You can think of Pan blowing the flute and the goats dancing around and so forth in Greek mythology and so forth. It's a place of extreme idolatry. Well, Jesus went up to Caesarea Philippi and spent some time in Caesarea Philippi. He leads his disciples up to Caesarea Philippi to a place, like I said, of extreme idolatry. The cave pen, which is off to your right there, and also you can actually see it on the one to the left as well, is a large cavern. It's a place dedicated to the worship of the god Pan. It's called the gates of Hades, or the gates of hell, because of this large cavern and it's the deepness of this cavern and so forth. So they talk about the place, that's where you would find hell or go into hell if you were to decide to be a spell dunker and take a trip down there with a rope and so forth. The Temple of Pan is there. You see the artist's rendition. Maybe a better picture that you can see here is this one right here that I'm showing you. All these little places and nooks are places of worship where idols were. Here's one place here. A temple was right here. Here's another place. Here's another place. All along here, along this mountain here, are different kinds of enclaves that are for the purposes of worshiping false gods. Here's the artist's rendition of what it looked back in that day there, when people went there in order to worship these false gods and so forth. This idolatry that was there and present. Temples of false gods. This one here is one called the Temple of Pan of the Dancing Goats. This one here is the Court of Nemesis. This one here is the Temple of Zeus. This one is the Temple of the Sacred Goats and so forth. There are these false gods that were, that they probably weren't there exactly when Jesus was there, but all the foundation of what was coming was on the way in Caesarea of Philippi. As I mentioned to you, Herman Springs is there. It begins at the foot of Mount Herman, and then it flows down as an extremely pure kind of water. It's absolutely beautiful water when you are around. It's refreshing. It's cool even on a hot day. So here's my question for you this evening as we kind of start to wrap things up, and that is this. What do you think that is the significance of me talking about Caesarea Philippi? What would be the significance of that? Well, the significance of that, because you're saying, okay, I'm not raising my hand and revealing anything, is this. It was here that Jesus revealed to his disciples that he was the Messiah. An interesting thing when you think about the Son of God declares himself to be the Messiah in the midst of a culture war, in the midst of all this idolatry and false gods all around. He asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? Some say you're Jeremiah. Some say you're Elijah. Some say you're John the Baptist. Some say you're one of the prophets. But Jesus said, but who do you say that I am? And remember Peter's answer? You are the Christ, the Son of what? The living God. Completely different from all these other gods that are dead gods. Mythology. Jesus is the Son of the living God. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. Flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock, this bedrock confession that I am the Christ, that I am the Son of God, I will build my church. And the gates of what? The gates of Hades, the cave of Hades, the gate of Hades shall not overcome it. They would have made the connection, boom, right there because of the place in which they found themselves. Culture wars. The living God or the devices of men. When you talk about Tel Dan, when you talk about Caesarea Philippi, when you talk about Chorazin or Capernaum or any of those other places, you can look at those places and you say, you know what, those people were so crazy because they followed after all those false gods. They follow after gods made of stone and wood. What about God? People today may not bow down to the idols of stone or wood, but we worship at the altar of money, making sacrifice to false gods of fashion and physical beauty. We pay homage to sports teams and magnify the names of performers. This type of idolatry is no less the idolatry of Dan and will also lead to misery and destruction. Gary Massey wrote that. I thought that was, well, I took note of it and I highlighted it in my book. Gary's going to be coming and speaking to us here 6 weeks from now, but he went to Israel as well. He's the one that encouraged me to think about going to Israel one day, and he too saw the culture war. He saw what was going on there, and it's so easy for us in the midst of our culture war to think that we are so different from they, when in reality we may not be. And so it challenges us to look into our own hearts and into our own lives and ask, who are we serving? Who is the God of my life? Who is the one that I put my trust and my confidence in? And of course, obviously, the encouragement would be that we place our confidence and our trust in Jesus Christ, who is the Son of the living God. So the report or lesson or whatever you call it is yours. And so let's stand and sing. If you need to respond, why don't you do so at this time?
Great